Moon Called by Patricia Briggs, Chapter 5. A Vanagon resembles nothing so much as a Twinkie on wheels. A 15-foot long, 6-foot wide Twinkie with as much aerodynamic styling as a barn door. In the 12 years the V-Dub imported them into the U.S., they never put anything bigger than a 4-cylinder Wasser Boxer engine. My 1989 four-wheel drive 4,000-pound Synchros engine put out a whopping 90 horses. In layman's terms, that means I was cruising up the interstate with the dead body and a wounded werewolf at 60 miles an hour. Downhill with a good tailwind, the van could go about 75. Uphill, I was lucky to make 50. I could have pushed a little faster, but I only if I wanted a chance of blowing my engine altogether. For some reason, the thought of being stranded by the roadside with my current cargo was enough to keep my foot off the gas pedal. The highway stretched out before me in gentle curves that were mostly empty of traffic and scenery beauty unless you liked scrub desert better than I did. I didn't want to think of Mac or Jesse or Scared and Alone or Adam who might be dying because I choose to move him rather than call his pack. So I took out my cell phone. I called my neighbors first. Dennis Cather was a retired pipe fitter, and his wife Anna a retired nurse. They moved in 2 years ago and adopted me after I fixed their tractor. Yes, Anna's voice is so normal after the morning I'd had. It took me a moment to answer. Sorry to call you so early, I told her, but I've been called out of town on a family emergency. I shouldn't be gone long, just a day or two, but I didn't check to make sure Medea had food and water. Don't fret, dear, she said. We'll look after her and hope that it's nothing serious. I couldn't help but glance back at Adam in the rearview mirror. He was still breathing. It's serious. One of my foster family is hurt. You go take care of what you need, she said briskly. We'll see to things here. And it wasn't until after I cut connection that I wondered if I involved them in something dangerous. Mac had been left on my doorstep for a reason, and warning to keep my nose out of someone's business. And I was most certainly sticking to my whole head in it now. I was doing just as much as I could for Adam, and I thought of something I could do for Jesse, and I called Z. Z-Bowl Alabaster, Z for short, had taught me anything. I knew about cars. The Fae were very sensitive to iron, but Z was a metal zobber, which is a rather broad category name given to the few Fae who could handle metal of all kinds. Z preferred a modern American term gremlin, which he felt better fit his talents. I wasn't calling him for his talents, but for his connections. Ja, said a gruff male voice. Hey Z, it's Mercy. I have a favor to ask. Ja, sure, Liebing. He said. What's up? I hesitated. Even after all this time, the rule of keeping pack trouble in the pack was hard to break. But Z knew everyone in the Fae community. I outlined the past day to him best I could. So you think this baby werewolf of yours brought this trouble here? Why did they take our client Jesse? I don't know, I said. I'm hoping that when Adam recovers, he'll know something more. So you're asking me to see if anyone I know has seen these strange wolves in hopes of finding Jesse? There were at least 4 werewolves moving into the Tri-Cities. You'd think that someone among the Fae would have noticed, because the Tri-Cities are so close to Walla Walla Fae Reservation that there were more Fae living here than was usual. Jazzy agreed heavily. You think I will ask around? Jessie is a good girl. She should not be in these evil men's hands longer than we can help. If you go by the garage, would you mind putting a note in the window? I asked. There's a closed for the holiday sign under the counter in the office. You think they might come after me if I opened it for you? He asked. He often ran the garage if I had to be out of town. You may be right, Jog. I'll open the garage today and tomorrow. It had been a long time since Ebo Albert Smider was of the Black Forest had been sung about so long that those songs had faded from memory. But there was something of the spirit of Heldenreiter, the old German hero songs, about him still. A werewolf doesn't need a sword or a gun to tear you into bits, I said, unable to leave it alone, though I knew better than to argue with an old gremlin once he'd made up his mind. Your metalwork magic won't be much help against me, he snorted. Don't you worry about me, Lieberg. I was killing werewolves when this country was still a Viking colony. Many of the lesser fae talked about how old they were, but Z told me that most of them had shared a lifespan similar to humankind. Z was a lot older than that. I sighed and gave in. All right, be careful. If you're going to be there, I have a parts order that should be in. Could you check it out for me? I haven't ordered from this place before, but my usual source was out. Job will leave it to me. The next call I made was to Stefan's answer machine. Hey, Stefan, I told it. This is Mercy. I'm headed to Montana today. I don't know when I'll be back. Probably late this evening. I'll give you a call. I hesitated, but there wasn't a good time to say the next part. Had to haul a dead body in your van. It's fine. Elizaveta Arkadovna cleaned it, and I'll explain when I get back. Mentioning Elizaveta reminded me of something else I needed to do. Adam's house was on the end of the road, but it was clearly visible from the river. Someone would notice the couch was sitting on the flower beds and call the police if the mess wasn't cleaned up soon. I had her number on my phone, though I never had occasion to use it before. Got her answering machine and left a message telling her that there was a mess at Adam's house. There had been a dead man on my porch. Jesse was missing and was taking Adam, who was wounded somewhere he'd be safe. When I closed the phone and put it away, I didn't know what happened at Adam's house. But the night when the two bullies came to find Mac, would everyone still be alive? If I sent Mac to Montana, to the Morrock, rather than letting Adam take him, what would that have changed? Taking Mac to the Morrock had never even occurred to me. I hadn't contacted Brand since he'd sent me away from the pack, and he returned the favor. I took a quick glance behind my seat and the blue tarp concealing Mac's body, while I was bringing Mac to him now. Found myself remembering the shy grin Mac had worn when I told him my name. I wiped my cheeks and fiercely blinked back further tears, but it was no use. I cried for him, for his parents, and for his brother who didn't even know he was dead. Doubtless they were all sitting beside their phones waiting for him to call again. I was coming down the grade into Spokane before pressing worries distracted me from grief and guilt. Adam began stirring, and my fear that Adam would die was instantly overwhelmed by the worry that he'd heal too fast. I still had well over 200 miles to go, most of the two-lane mountain highway meandering through the dozens of small towns in 25 miles an hour. The last 60 miles was on a road marked Other on the state highway map, as opposed to a highway or a road. As I recalled, it was gravel most of the way, and I figured it would take me at least 4 more hours. Dominant wolves hear faster than submissive wolves. On my rough estimate, it would be no more than 2 days before Adams recovered enough to control his wolf, which would be capable of mayhem long before that. I needed Bram before Adam was mobile. And if he was stirring already, I was going to be lucky if I made it. When I hit the Coeur d'Alene, where I'd had to leave the interstate for highway, I gassed up and drove to the first fast food burger place I found and bought 30 cheeseburgers. The bemused teenager who started handing me bags through the service window peered curiously at me. I didn't explain. She couldn't see my passengers because of the van's curtains. I parked in the restaurant's parking lot, snatched up a couple of the bags, stepped over a Mac, and began stripping the buns off the meat. Adam was too weak to do more than growl at me and snatched the cheese and ketchup-covered meat as fast as I could toss it to him. He ate almost 20 patties before he subsided into his previous coma-like state. The first few flakes of snow began falling on us as I took the highway north. I drove into Troy, Montana, cursing the heavy, wet snow that had distracted me, so I missed my turnoff, which should have been several miles earlier. I topped off my gas tank, got directions, chained up, and headed back the way I'd come. Snow was falling fast enough that the snow crews hadn't been able to keep up with it, and the tracks of the cars preceding me were rapidly filling. The gas station clerk's directions fresh in my mind, I slowed and I crossed back over the Yak River. It was a baby river compared to the Kootenai, which I've been driving next to for the past few hours. I watched the side of the road carefully, and it was a good thing I did. A small green sign that marked the turnoff was half covered in wet snow. There was only one set of tracks up the road, and they turned off to a narrow drive, and after that, I found my way up the road by driving where there were no trees. Happily, the trees were dense and marked the way pretty clearly. The road twisted up and down a narrow river valley, and I was grateful for the four-wheel drive. Once a couple of black-tailed deer darted in front of me, and they gave me an irritated glance and trotted off. It had been a long time since I'd been that way. I hadn't even had my driver's license then. The road was unfamiliar, and I began to worry I'd miss my turn. The road divided, one half clearly marked, but the other half, the one I had to take, was barely wide enough for my van. Well, I told Adam, who was whining restlessly, if we end up in Canada, you haven't eaten me yet. I suppose we can turn around, come back, and try again. I'd about decided I was going to have to do just that when I topped the long grade and saw the hand-carved wooden sign. I stopped the van. Aspen Creek, the sign read in graceful script carved with a painted white and dark brown background, 23 miles. As I turned the van to follow the arrow, I wondered when Brand had decided to allow someone to post a sign. Maybe he'd gotten tired of having to send out guides, but he'd been adamant about keeping a low profile when I left. I don't know why I expected everything to be the same. After all, I changed a good deal in the years since I'd last been there. I should have expected Aspen Creek would have changed too, and I didn't have to like it. The uninitiated would be forgotten for thinking that there were only 4 buildings in Aspen Creek. The gas station, post office, the school, the church, and the motel. They wouldn't see the homes tucked unobtrusively up in the draws and under the trees. There were a couple cars in front of the gas station, but otherwise the whole town looked deserted. I knew better. There were always people watching. They wouldn't bother me unless I did something unusual, like dragging a wounded werewolf out of my van. I stopped in front of the motel office just under the Aspen Creek Motel sign, which bore more than a passing resemblance to the sign I followed to town. The old motel was built the way the hotels had been in the middle of the last century. A long, narrow, no-frills building designed so guests could park their vehicles in front of their rooms. There was no one in the office, but the door was unlocked, and it had been updated since I'd been there last, but the end result was a rustic charm, which was better than the run-down 1950s tacky it had been. I helped over the front desk and took the key marked number 1. Number 1 was marked safe room, specifically designed to contain uncooperative werewolves. I found a piece of paper and a pen and wrote, "Wounded in number 1, please do not disturb." I left the note on the desk where it couldn't be missed, and then I returned to the van and backed it up to the room. Getting Adam out of the van was going to be rough no matter what. At least when I dragged him into it, he was unconscious. I opened the reinforced metal door of the motel room and took a look around. The furnishings was new but sparse. Just a bed and a nightstand was permanently fixed against the wall. Nothing to help me get a werewolf who weighed twice as what I did out of the van and into a room without hurting one or the other of us. There was no drop porch, as there had been in Adam's house, which left an almost 4-foot drop from the back of the van to the ground. In the end, I decided that calling for help was better than hurting Adam worse. I went back to the office and picked up the phone. I hadn't called Sam's number since I'd left, but some things are just ingrained. Even though he was the reason I left here, he was the first one I thought to call for help. "Hello," answered a woman's voice that sounded completely unfamiliar. I couldn't speak. I hadn't realized how much I'd been counting on hearing Samuel until I heard someone else's voice instead. "Marley, is there something wrong at the motel? Do you need me to send Carl?" She must have caller ID, I thought stupidly. She sounded frantic, but I recognized her voice at last. I felt a wave of relief. I don't know why Lisa Stovall was answering this number, but the mention of Carl and a sudden tension in her voice cued me in. I guess she had just never sounded cheerful when she talked to me. Some things might have changed, but some things I had just forgotten. Aspen Creek had a population of about 500 people, and only about 70 were werewolves. But I seldom thought about the human majority. Lisa and her husband Carl were both human, so was Marley. At least she had been when I left. She also had been about 6 years old. "I don't know where Marley is," I told her. "This is Mercedes Thompson. There's no one in the motel office. I'd really appreciate it if you send Carl down here to tell him who else to call, or tell me who else to call. I have the Alpha from the Columbia Basin packed in my van. He's badly wounded and I need help getting him into the motel room. Even better would be if you could tell me how to get a hold of Bran." Bran didn't have a telephone at his home, or hadn't when I left. For all I knew, he had a cell phone now. Lisa, like most of the women in Aspen Creek, had never liked me, but she wasn't one of those people who let a little thing like that get in the way of doing what was right and proper. Bran had some of the others have taken the new wolves out for their first hunt. Marley's probably holed up somewhere crying. Lee, her mother, was one of the ones who tried to change. He didn't make it. I'd forgotten how could I have forgotten? The last full moon of October, and of those who choose to try to become werewolves were allowed to come forward. In a formal ceremony, they were savaged by Bran, or by some other wolf who loved them in hopes that they would rise changed. Most of them didn't make it, and I remember tension that gripped the town through October and sadness in November. Thanksgiving had a different meaning of the residents of Aspen Creek than it did for the rest of America. "I'm sorry," I said inadequately, feeling rawly incapable of dealing with more dead youngsters. I remember Lee, too. Lee was a good kid. "I'll send Carl." Lisa's voice was crisp. "Deny me the right to grieve or sympathize." She hung up without saying goodbye. I avoided thinking, looking at the tarp that covered Mac while I sat there in the van waiting for help. Instead, I fed Adam the remaining hamburgers while we waited. They were cold and congealed, but it didn't seem to bother the wolf. When they were gone, he closed his eyes and ignored me. At long last, Carl pulled up next to me in a beat-up Jeep and climbed out. He was a big man, and he had always been more of a man of action than words. He hugged me back and thumped me on my back. "Don't be such a stranger, Mercy," he said, and laughed at my look of shock and ruffled my hair. I'd forgotten he liked to do that, forgotten the easy affection he showed to everyone, even Bran. "Lisa said you have Adam here and he's in bad shape?" "Of course, he'd know who the Alpha of the Columbia Basin pack was. Adam's pack was the closest to Aspen Creek. I nodded and opened the back of my van so he could see that what we were dealing with. Adam looked better than he had the first time I put him in the van, but that wasn't saying much. I couldn't see the bones of his ribs anymore, but the coat was matted with blood and covered with wounds. Carl whistled through his teeth, but all he said was, "We need to tie his jaws shut until we get him in. I've got something we could use in the Jeep." He brought an ace bandage and we wound it around Adam's muzzle. Luke opened his eyes once, but didn't struggle. It took a lot of grunting, a few swear words, and a little sweat, but the two of us managed to get Adam out of the van and into the room. Once we had him on the bed, I made Carl get back before the unwounded, unwound the bandage, and freed the wolf. I was fast, but even so, Adam caught my forearm with an eye tooth and drew blood. I jumped back as he rolled off his side and struggled to stand, driven to defend himself against the pain we caused him. "Out," Carl said, holding the door for me. I complied, and we shut the door behind us. Carl held it shut while I turned the key in the deadbolt. Unlike most motel rooms, this deadbolt opened the key from both sides, for just such situations. The windows were barred and the vents were sealed. Number 1 served as a prison and hospital on occasion, sometimes both. Adam was safe for now. Once he'd regained a little more strength, things can still get problematical unless I track down Bran. "Do you know where Bran took the new wolves?" I asked, shutting the back of the hatch of the van. Carl hadn't asked me about Mac. He didn't have a wolf's nose to tell him that he was in the tarp. I decided that Mac would ride with me for a while longer. Bran would decide what to do with his body. "You don't want to go after him, Mercy?" Carl was saying. "Too dangerous. Why would you come home with me? We'll feed you while you wait." "How many wolves are left in town?" I asked. "Is there anyone who could resist Adam's wolf?" That was the downside of being dominant. If you did go moonstruck, you took everyone else who was less dominant with you. Carl hesitated. "Adam's pretty weak yet. Bran will be back by dark." Something hit the door, and we both jumped. "He took them up to Lover's Canyon," Carl told me, giving in for the obvious. "Be careful." "Bran will have control over the new ones," I told him. "I'll be alright." "I'm not worried about them. You left enemies behind you, girl." I smiled tightly. "I can't help what I am. Even if they are my enemies, it was not by my choice." "I know, but they still kill you if they can." The lovers were a pair of trees that had grown up and twined around each other near the entrance to a small canyon about 10 miles north. I parked next to the pair of old-style Land Rovers, a nearly new Chevy Tahoe, and a Humvee, an expansion version. Charles, Brand's son, was a financial genius, and there was the Morrow's pack. Would never be begging on street corners. When I left here, I had $10,000 in a bank account, the result of part of my minimum wage earnings invested by Charles. I stripped off my clothes in the van, jumped onto knee-deep snow, and shut the door. It was colder up in the mountains than it had been in Troy, and the snow had a crust of ice crystals that had cut into the bare skin of my feet. I shifted as fast as I could. I might have been safer to go as a human, but I didn't have the right kind of clothing on this winter hike in Montana. I'm not absolutely sure there is a right kind of clothing for winter and hike in Montana. Running as a coyote, I don't mind the cold all that much. I'd grown used to the city scents and sounds. The forest scents were no less strong, just different: fir, aspen, and pine instead of exhaust, fried grease, and humans. I heard the distinctive rat-a-tat of a woodpecker, and faintly the howl of a wolf too deep to be that of a timber wolf. The fresh snow, which was still falling, had done a fair job of hiding their tracks, but I could still smell them. Bran and his mate, Leah, both had brushed up against the burrow of a white pine. Charles had left tracks where the ground was half sheltered by a boulder. Once my nose drew me to the right places, I could see where the old snow had been broken by paws before the snow had begun, and the tracks weren't difficult to follow. I hesitated when the wolves' tracks began to separate. Bran had taken the new wolves. There seemed to be three of them, while his sons Charles and Samuel and Leah, Bran's mate, broke off, probably to hunt up game in hopes of chasing it back to the rest. I needed to find Bran to tell him what had happened, to get his help for Adam, but I followed Sam's trail instead. I couldn't help it. I've been in love with him since I was 14. Not that I'm in love with him now, I assured myself, following his tracks down an abrupt drop in the back of the ridge top, where the snow wasn't as deep because of the wind periodically swept it clean. I was only a teenager when I last saw him, I thought. I hadn't spoken to him since then, and he hadn't tried to contact me either. Still, it had been his number I'd called for help. I hadn't even thought about calling anyone else. On the tail of that I thought, I realized the forest had fallen silent behind me, and the winter woods were quiet. The birds, except for the scattering of nuthatches, cedar wax wings, and a few others like the woodpecker I heard. I'd gone south, but there was an ominous quality to the silence behind me that was too heavy to only winter stillness, and I was being stalked. I didn't look around, nor did I speed up. Werewolves chase things that run from them. And I wasn't really frightened. Bran was out there somewhere, and Samuel was even nearer. I could smell the earth and spice musk that belonged to him alone. The wind carried it to me. The tracks I was following had been laid several hours ago. He must have been returning it the way he'd come, otherwise he'd have been too far away for me to scent. The new wolves were all with Bran, and the one following me was alone. If there had been more than one, I would have heard something, so I didn't have to be worried about the new wolves killing me by mistake because they thought I was a coyote. I didn't think it was Charles stalking me either. It would be beneath his dignity to frighten me on purpose. Samuel liked playing practical jokes, but the wind doesn't lie, and it told me he was somewhere just ahead. I was pretty sure it was Lee. She wouldn't kill me no matter what Carl had implied, nor with Bran sure to find out. But she would hurt me if she could, because she didn't like me. None of the women in Bran's pack liked me. The wind carrying Samuel's scent was coming mostly from the west. The trees on that side were young firs, probably regrowing after the fire that must have happened a decade or so in the past. Furs were tucked together in a closed blanket that wouldn't slow me at all. But a werewolf was a lot bigger than I. I scratched my ear with a hind foot and used the movement to get a good look behind me. There was nothing to see, so my stalker was far enough from me to reach the denser trees. I put my foot down and darted for the trees. The wolf behind me howled her hunting song. Instincts takes over when a wolf is on the hunt. Had she been thinking, Lee would never have uttered a sound, because she was immediately answered by a chorus of howls. Most of the wolves sounded like they were a mile or so farther into the mountains, but Samuel answered her call from no more than 100 yards in front of me. I altered my course accordingly and found my way through the thicket of trees, and out the other side where Samuel had been traveling. He stopped dead in my appearance. I suppose he was expecting a deer or elk, not a coyote, not me. Samuel was big even for a werewolf. His fur was winter white, and his eyes appeared almost the same shade, an icy white blue, colder than the snow, and I ran through, all the more startling for the black ring that edged his iris. There was plenty of room for me to dive under his belly and out the other side, leaving him between me and my pursuer. Before he had a chance to do more than give me a first startled look, Lee appeared, a gold and silver huntress, as beautiful as Samuel in her own light, and fire where he was ice. She saw Samuel and skidded ungracefully to a halt. I suppose she'd been so hot on the chase she hadn't been paying attention to Samuel's call. I couldn't see the instant he realized who I was. He cocked his head and his body grew still. He recognized me all right, but I couldn't tell how he felt about it. After the space of a deep breath, he turned back to look at Leah. Lee cringed and rolled onto her back. Though as Brand's wife, she would have outranked Samuel. Unimpressed by the snow, he curled his lips away from his fangs and growled. A deep rumbling sound that echoed in my chest. It felt like old times. Samuel protected me from the rest of the pack. A wolf howled nearer than before, and Samuel stopped growling long enough to answer. He looked expectantly towards the north. In a few minutes, 2 wolves came into his sight. The first one was the color of cinnamon with 4 black feet. He was a shade bigger than even Samuel. The second werewolf was considerably smaller. From a distance, he could have passed as one of the wolves that had only this decade begun to return to Montana. His coat was with all the shades between white and black, combining to make him appear medium gray. His eyes were pale gold, and at the end of his tail was white. Charles, the cinnamon wolf, stopped at the edge of the trees and began to change. He was an oddity among the werewolves, a natural-born werewolf rather than made. The only one of his kind I've ever heard of. Charles' mother had been a Salish woman, the daughters of a medicine man. She had been dying when Brand came across her. Shortly after he arrived in Montana, according to my foster mother, who told me the story. Brand had been so struck with her beauty that he couldn't just let her die, so he changed her and made her his mate. I never could wrap my imagination around the thought of Brand being overcome by love at first sight, but maybe he had been different 200 years ago. At any rate, when she became pregnant, she used the knowledge of magic her father had given her to keep from changing at the full moon. Female werewolves cannot have children. The change is too violent to allow the fetus to survive. But Charles' mother, as her father's daughter, had some magic of her own. She managed to carry Charles to term, but was so weakened by her efforts that she died soon after his birth. She left her son with 2 gifts. The first was that he could change easier and faster. The second was the gift for magic that was unusual in werewolves. Brand's pack did not have to hire a witch to clean up after them. They had Charles. Brand, the smaller of the 2 wolves, continued on to where I stood awaiting him. Samuel stepped aside reluctantly, though he was still careful to keep between Lee and me. There was no sense of power about Brand, not like the one his sons and Adam carried. I'm not certain how he contained it. I've been told that sometimes even by other werewolves, whose senses are sharper than mine, mistake him for a real wolf or some wolf-dog hybrid to account for his size. I don't know how old he is. All I know is that he was old when he came to this continent to work as a fur trapper in the late 18th century. He traveled to this area of Montana with the Welsh cartographer David Thompson and settled to live with his Salish mate. He padded up to me and touched his muzzle behind my ear. I didn't have to sink submissively to be lower than he, but I hunched down anyway. He took my nose between his fangs and released it, a welcome and a gentle chiding all in one. Though wasn't certain what he was chiding me for. Once he released me, he stalked past Samuel and stared down at his wife, still lying in the snow. She whined anxiously as he bared his teeth, unappeased, it seemed, that even though he'd once asked me to leave, I wasn't to be viewed as fair game. Bran turned his back on her to look at Charles, who had completed his transformation and stood tall and human. Charles' features were pure Salish, and if the only thing he'd gotten from his father was the ability to change. I've been told that the Native Americans were shy about their bodies. It was certainly true of Charles. He'd used his magic to clothe himself and stood garbed in fur-lined buckskins that looked as if they had come from another century. I, like most shapeshifters, was nearly as comfortable naked as clothed, except for in the middle of November high up in the Rockies of Montana, with a chill Canadian wind blowing from the northwest, and the temperature beginning to drop as the snow quilt falling at last. And as soon as Charles started to speak, I was going to have to become human so I could talk to him. "My father bids you welcome to the territory of Marok," Charles said, his voice carrying the flat tones of his mother's people with just a hint of the Welsh little Bran no longer spoke with unless he was really angry. "He wonders, however, why you have chosen now to come." I took human form quickly and kicked the snow away from me, then knelt deep to lower myself lower than Bran. I sucked in my breath at the chill and the wind and the snow under my shins. Samuel moved between me and the worst of the wind, and it helped, but not enough. "I came on pack business," I told them. Charles raised his eyebrows. "You come smelling of blood and death." Charles always had a good nose. I nodded. "I brought the Colombian Basin Alpha here. He's badly wounded, and I also brought the body of another wolf, hoping someone here could tell me how he died or who killed him." Bran made a soft sound, and Charles nodded. "Tell us what is necessary now. You can give us the details later." So I told them what I knew, and succinctly as possible, beginning with Mac's story, as he had told it to me, and ending with Mac's death, Adam's wounds, and Jesse's kidnapping. By the time I was finished, my teeth were chattering, and I could barely understand myself. Even when I shifted back into coyote form, I couldn't quite warm up. Bran glanced at Samuel, who gave a woof and took off at a dead run. "Bran will finish the hunt with the new ones," Charles told me. "It is their first hunt. It should not be interrupted. Samuel is going back to take care of Adam. He'll take a shorter route than the automobiles can manage, so he'll be there before us. I'll ride back with you and take care of your dead." And on the trail end of Charles' wounds, Bran trotted off into the forest without looking at me again. Lee rose from her submissive pose, growled at me like it was my fault she'd gotten herself into trouble, and followed Bran. Charles, still in human form, strode off in the direction of the cars. He wasn't talkative at the best of times, and with me still 4-footed and mute, he didn't bother to say anything at all. He waited politely on the passenger side of the van while I transformed again and dove into my clothes. He didn't object to me driving as Samuel would have. I had never seen Charles drive a car, and he preferred to ride horseback or run as a wolf. He climbed into the passenger seat and glanced once behind him at the dark body. Without commenting, he belted himself in. When we got back to the motel, I pulled in at the office door. Carl was in the office with a red-eyed young woman who must have been the missing Marley, though I couldn't see the 6-year-old I'd known. "Mercedes needs a room," Charles told them. Carl didn't question him, just handed me a key. "This is on the side away from the road, as far as from number 1 as we can get." I looked down at the number 18 stamped on the key. Don't you know you're not supposed to put the room number on the key anymore? I asked. We don't have much trouble with burglary, Carl said, smiling. Besides, I know you spent a couple of years working here. Except for number 1, there are only 3 different locks for all the rooms. I smiled at him and tossed the key up once and caught it. True enough. Charles opened the door for me as we left. If you'll get your luggage and give me your car keys, I'll take them to take care of the body. I must have looked surprised. Don't worry, he told me dryly. I'll have Carl drive. No luggage, I told him. Pulled out my keys and gave it to him. I caught his hand before he pulled away. Mac was a good man, I told him. I don't know why I said it. Charles didn't touch any more casually. I had always thought that he'd rather despise me, though he treated me with the same remote courtesy he used to with everyone else. But he put his free hand on the back of my hand and pulled my forehead briefly against his shoulder. I'll take care of him, he promised as he stepped back. His full name is Alan Mackenzie Fraser. He nodded. I'll see that he's treated well. Thank you, I told him, and turned and walked towards my room before I could start to cry again.